Rise and shine, boys and girls. Time to move on to what I think is the best unit, genetics. And we can see here at the bottom of the screen, the story of a dead dude. Well, this isn't history class. We don't really care about dead guys. But in the next lesson, we are going to actually talk about a dead guy and why he's so important and why he's considered to be the father of genetics. In fact, his big ugly face is hanging in a mural on our wall in the hallway. But more about him later. First, we've got to go back and think about what we already learned in class. Back in day 2 of the class, we went over characteristics of life. What does it mean to be alive? Now you remember, there was a large list of characteristics, 8 of them in fact, made up of cells, must respond to the environment, but there are only going to be 2 that we really care about here in this lesson. The first one, reproduce, is kind of self-explanatory. If you want to be alive, you've got to make more of your species of organism. Now you can do that asexually with one organism, or what we're going to care about more in this unit, sexually. 2 organisms combining together in some way to create new offspring that actually are going to be just like, or very much like, the original parents. The other key characteristic that we care about here must be based on a genetic code. Well, code, we've looked at that already and what that implies, but a genetic code, if you look at the word here, genetic, there's this gene, the first 4 letters. We've mentioned the term gene before with the idea that something we've talked about already, DNA, genes, and chromosomes really are, for all intents and purposes here, the same thing. They're all talking about the same thing. That DNA contains discrete units called genes, and when we, as you recall from mitosis, coil up this DNA and wrap it around proteins, they become dense bodies called chromosomes. Look at that another way. Here's our DNA in the form of a ladder. Each section has genes in there, or discrete packets of information that can coil up to create these structures called chromosomes, which are housed in the nucleus of a cell. And recall that you're made up of trillions and trillions and trillions of cells, just like this creepy blue guy with no face. So if we take that information and we need to start thinking about some questions with regards to DNA and genetics. For example, why do you have the eye color you do? Why do you have the skin tone that you do? And why do others have different skin tones? Maybe you have freckles, or maybe you don't. Why? Maybe you have dimples. Same reasoning. Why? Maybe you have 1 dimple. Maybe you have 2. Maybe siblings, your brothers or sisters, that have different characteristics here than you. Or in some cases, unfortunately, which we'll look at later, some individuals are born unlucky and can have genetic disorders or diseases. Why is that? Going back to look at the creepy eyes again, notice that it's not as easy as blue, green, brown. There are shades of varying degrees of greens and browns and weird amoeba-looking shapes and everything in between. Kind of freaky. Stop looking at me. This one looks evil. And what about this picture? Why are they all dressed in these weird black suits? Well, that's not of importance to us, but if you look, there's a gradient here, a spectrum, where we're showing varying degrees of skin tones, from very, very light fair skin all the way down to very dark skin, and everything in between. Is that due to genetics? What about this guy? Why does he have these spots all over his back? Must be genetic, so we wouldn't be talking about it, but at the same time, can environment influence genes? Maybe these spots aren't there year-round. You ever notice that you can sometimes have more freckles or lighter colored hair or darker skin depending on the environment you're in? Creepy. So the last thing before we move on and talk about a dead dude in the next episode is just to remind ourselves of some basic information that we've already covered. Remember that our genome, a term we're going to be using quite often here in the class, which just means all of your genes, all of your DNA, lies or is housed in a package, if you will, of 46 chromosomes total. We got 23 from mom, 23 from dad. And if we look over here, here's a picture, a karyotype of these chromosomes. And notice 22 what are called autosomes, and then this last pair called sex chromosomes, which we're going to see later on are important in determining the sex of the offspring. But let's look at, for example, chromosome 11 here. There's 2 chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. Notice they're similar size, similar shape, and they even, if we could somehow move in and look at the genes, the information that was in here, they have very similar genes. For example, perhaps right here on this chromosome and on this chromosome, there are genes for eye color. Maybe over on these 2 chromosomes, there are genes or instructions for height, and so on and so on. Those are the specifics we'll be looking at in a little bit. So just remember that, again, chromosomes are simply DNA, and DNA are chromosomes, and genes are on the DNA, are on the chromosomes. So all these traits that you have that make you you, chromosomes, DNA, and genes. And last but not least, we can't forget the fact of where you came from. Without being too gross and too graphic, ugh. Sperm cells and egg cells, through sexual reproduction in some way, shape, or form, unite. There were 23 chromosomes in the sperm cell, 23 in the egg cell. When they combine, they form what are called a zygote. 46 chromosomes, 2 copies of each gene, and that then, through mitosis, which we last learned about, becomes you. Still no answers on how these genes work, but for now, that'll have to do.